Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Once again, like I always say, it just wouldn't be a podcast without all kinds of bizarre, weird things happening. I was working on the show, typing up my notes, so when I start talking, I know what the heck I'm saying. Otherwise, I get easily sidetracked. So I'm sitting at my desk, typing away, and I spilled a cup of coffee on my keyboard. Well, it was the whole cup, and my keyboard immediately stopped working. So I had to run to the store and buy a wireless keyboard for $20 that I could use until a new keyboard arrives in the mail. Well, that just made my whole week. But then on a happier note, I figured out what was wrong with the air conditioner that cools the studio, so hopefully now it won't be making so much noise in the background. Quite a week. Yep, quite a week. Tonight, we're talking about emergency medical stories. I first became an EMT back in 1983. In 36 years, things have changed a lot. Mostly for the better, but then things always get a bit complicated too. I attended class at San Jacinto College in Pasadena, Texas. We had to take so many hours of classroom, and then we had to do clinical hours at different hospitals and ride along in ambulances. If you're about to become a medic and you're taking the classes or you're thinking about taking the classes, take my advice. Do the hospital hours first. Then you can enjoy the ambulance runs. If you do the ambulance runs first and then go to the hospital, it's like driving a tricycle after driving a car. Some of the nurses can be a bit, nasty and vindictive. I don't know what it is. They just seem to hate medics, or maybe they just don't like students. I was at one of the hospitals, and the charge nurse told me that I should go with this doctor. He was going to perform a procedure that I needed to see. So I followed this guy who was wearing a white lab coat as he entered an exam room. And he was a proctologist. I now know what the inside of the colon looks like, and I'll never get that image out of my mind. When I got back to the desk, all the nurses were looking at me and giggling, and, I guess it was some kind of an inside joke. In the ambulance, you get to meet people doing unusual things. We were at the hospital, trying to finish up our paperwork one night, when a security guard yelled, "There's some guy doing CPR in the parking lot." Well, we grabbed a hospital stretcher and ran outside. The guy was trying to do compressions on the front seat of a car. We managed to pull him out and got his girlfriend onto the stretcher. She was not in arrest. She was having convulsions. There's just a huge difference between the two. Well, hospital stretchers don't have straps, so we had to hold her on while we ran back inside, trying to push the stretcher and pull the stretcher and hold this woman in the middle of the stretcher at the same time. It was not very entertaining. The charge nurse told us to place a heart monitor on the woman, even though she was definitely not having a heart attack. You see, the initial report was CPR, and so therefore they had to follow up on it like it was a heart attack, even though it wasn't. Well, the patient was flopping around on the stretcher, so we had to still hold her on as we tried to do what we needed to do. This was a very well-built woman. Heart monitors are placed on the bare skin. I had to remove her shirt and her underthingies. It had 8 of those hooks on the back. It was quite a job. I got my arms under her, managed to unhook those things. Just as I got the last thing undone, and I was lifting the shirt and the thingy up over her head, she came to. Strange man in a strange place, removing clothing. Well, she got a little excited. Can't say I blame her. As she tried to bite my face off, literally. The 3 nurses had to come to our rescue. Lots of screaming, and it wasn't us. It turned out that the patient had epilepsy, and she was on medication, and she was drinking booze at the same time. Not a good combination. This was back when charge nurses decided the heart monitor wasn't needed anymore. The last day of class, right after we had passed our state exam, a hurricane blew in, and we never had our congratulations to the emergency medical ceremony. Instead, I was out looking for injured people in the aftermath of a huge storm. I believe it was Alicia, but I'm not quite sure. It drowned most of the Gulf Coast. I went to a lot of nasty car crashes and saw some things I wish I hadn't. A severed head sitting in the back seat of a car, for starts. A car with an unknown number of bodies because they were kind of mixed in with each other. One night, we had a car flip over and plow out a bar ditch. If you're not familiar with a bar ditch, certain coastal towns, instead of having sewer drains, they just have a deep ditch on either side of the road or the street. Usually these things are either full of mud or they're full of red ants. Take your pick. The driver was still sitting behind the wheel of his car after the thing had flipped twice and plowed out the ditch. His foot was sticking out through the steering wheel with the sole facing his head. It looked really bad. As we worked to free the man, he began to come to. Everybody was trying to keep him calm and not let him freak out at the bizarre angle his leg was now in. The man looked at his foot with the toes pointed in the wrong direction. He reached into his pants and wiggled his hands around, and the leg came off just below the knee. He crawled out the door, and then he asked if one of us would grab his leg. It was a prosthetic. We all breathed a sigh of relief. The driver was relatively uninjured, but his car was totaled. And one night, me and the assistant chief were over at the next town when we heard a call come in on the radio. A car had just been hit by a southbound train right across the highway from the station. We flew back to town, and we got there just as the first unit was arriving on scene. They'd had a hard time getting to where the car was because it was no longer across the street from the station. It was way down behind a bunch of warehouses on a set of tracks that you just about couldn't get to. We had to unload all of the emergency equipment and carry it to the scene. The car had started out at NASA Road 1 and Highway 146, and the train pushed it almost 10 blocks to 10th Street. The car was a Delta 88 land yacht. Big old car. There were 3 guys in it. And somehow the car had stayed upright as it was pushed along the tracks, starting sideways at 60 miles an hour, and then it slowed down before coming to a stop. The whole car was now about 1.5 feet wide. The train had hit right at the B-post. That's the center between the front and rear doors. The driver had the passenger sitting on top of him underneath the steering wheel. Yes, it looked just like that scene from Up in Smoke. The guy in the back seat was held in place, having both back doors up against his shoulders. And it was real quiet. We had to carry all the rescue gear to the scene, and then we fired up the hearse tool. We slowly and carefully took the car apart piece by piece, trying to keep the patients safe and alive. The guy in the back seat was freed first, and when the door was popped open, he was actually able to swing his legs out and stand up. We had to hold him upright, but he wasn't hurt as far as anyone could see. No blood. His vitals were good. Didn't have any signs of trauma. He may have needed new underwear, but that was about it. We cut the roof back and pulled the steering wheel up onto the hood to free the passenger from under it. He was able to move all of his extremities, and he wound up walking to the ambulance. Then the driver got out. We checked him over. No blood, no cuts, nothing broken. All three men had just survived being T-boned by a fast-moving train without so much as a scratch. Inconceivable. I used to live in an apartment right on NASA Road 1. The gym I went to was a half a block away, and it was only about 2 miles to the station. Late one Saturday night, I stepped out the door to throw some trash in the dumpster. As I was turning to close the door to my apartment, I heard the sound of tires squealing, followed by a thud, then followed by a second thud. I didn't even look. I reached inside the door and grabbed my two-way radio. I called dispatch and I said we just had a vehicle pedestrian and we needed an ambulance. I then jumped in my truck and pulled out to the street. It was all of 20 feet away. I did this because I wanted to block traffic with my truck. I had a light bar on the roof and turned on the lights, and then I looked at the scene of the accident. There was what looked like a young boy laying right in the middle of the street. The patient had been hit dead center on the hood of the first car, flipped backwards onto the street, landing on the head. Then the car ran over them right across the abdomen. A second car was unable to stop or swerve, so they ran over the pelvis. One foot was up behind the shoulder blades. I could see tire marks crossing the abdomen. Every time the patient breathed, the chest would move in the wrong direction. We call this a flail chest. Very much not good. I knelt at the patient's head and I tried to stabilize the neck. When I grasped the head, the skull felt like it wasn't all connected. The plates were moving around. Every time the patient exhaled, the tongue would flop out of the mouth that was only held in place by a tiny piece of skin. And just about every tooth was on the ground around me. Within seconds, a second medic arrived and began a full head to toe. We looked at each other with the unspoken knowledge we were probably not going to get this person to the ambulance. Once the clothing had been cut away to expose any injuries, we discovered this was actually a young woman. It's weird how you can perform your job doing all you can do while thinking the person in your hands is not going to make it. A man stopped right next to the accident scene, and he jumped out of his car and he said he was a doctor. In EMS, anytime anyone says they're a doctor at a bad scene, it means they're either a psychiatrist or a PhD. No, this guy was a real-life emergency room doctor, and he said he would help. He worked his magic, and we managed to scrape our patient off the street and got her onto the stretcher. We all just assumed she wouldn't make it to the hospital, which was 5 miles away. Well, she made it into surgery. The doctors all pretty much agreed she'd never walk. But she did. Not only did she walk, but she got a huge pile of money from the insurance companies of the 2 cars that had run her over. Enough to have her bodily looks increased and expanded. She didn't look anything like she did when she went into the hospital. In fact, she didn't look anything like she did days before the accident. It turned out she was my neighbor from across the street. I couldn't recognize her with all that blood and stuff, and she was also 30 years old at the time. I wonder how she's doing today. That was a bad accident. How she managed to survive such a traumatic injury and literally walk out of the hospital is beyond me. I guess it just wasn't her turn yet. I've had people tell me I lived an interesting life. The funny thing is, I consider it kind of normal and mundane. I tend to forget there are a lot of people out there who have never gone into a burning building or pulled somebody out of a burning car. To me, it was just part of life. I was in the fire department for 8 years, and then I moved on to the Border Patrol. After many years of seeing a few folks die due to not being able to get an ambulance out to where they were, the boss decided we were going to start our own rescue unit. I was voluntold that I was going to be on it. I was okay with this since I had kept up with some of my EMS skills. Unfortunately, I was being teamed up with a couple of agents that hated each other. They argued and complained about each other the whole time. Finally, one of them quit, went off to become an air marshal, and then a few months later, the other one did the same thing. I hate to think they ever put those 2 on the same plane together. At this time, the Border Patrol had started a rescue unit called BORSTAR, but we didn't have BORSTAR in our sector. They were all out west, out around the desert states. So our sector started our own unit, which we wound up calling the Border Area Rescue Team, or BART for short. I didn't pick the name. One of the female medics picked the name for the unit, and well, it stuck. We would ask all the agents to put in a request if they had any EMS experience, and after a few years we had 38 medics. We would rig out some Tahoes as 4-wheel drive ambulances, and we'd go to work. We saved a few and we lost a few, but we gave it our best. I saw some weird things. By the time I left there were about 100 medics working just our sector. We trained in-house a lot, so I got my instructor's certificate. I would tell my students you needed 2 things to be a good medic. You had to have a good sense of humor and a strong stomach. The rest is just knowing how to put a bandage on and start an IV. I also said that in a crisis situation you could only panic about one thing at a time. I would overemphasize that no matter what, you had to act like you knew what you were doing and that you could handle anything. The psychological effect on the patient was profound. I saw patients go from a 10 on the pain scale to a 5 just by saying we were going to take care of them and we were going to get them to the hospital just as soon as we could. I also told my students no matter what, you never, ever lied to your patients. You could guarantee them they were going to the hospital. They might not be alive when they got there, but they were going to go. We could guarantee they were going to see a doctor. Might be the medical examiner, but hey, she's a doctor. You never, ever said everything was going to be okay because there was no way that you knew this as a fact. I was working a scene late one night. A guy from somewhere way south had run across the road and got hit by a station wagon. That immediately left the scene. I was working with 2 EMTs from the community. They were doing all the bandaging and splinting while I worked the vitals. I couldn't get a blood pressure on either arm. The guy was talking to me. I asked him where he was from, and he lied, saying he lived right there in that house. Well, that house was a barn. I asked him what had happened, and he said he didn't know. I checked his pulse. It was way over 100 at the neck, but there was nothing at the extremities. Oddly enough, he was able to move his hands and feet, which makes absolutely no sense. To check for a spinal injury, you tell the patient to move their feet. Whether they move them or not, you tell them it looked good. If their feet moved or not, you make a note of it on the chart. You never tell the patient that they didn't move their feet. That's why I never use that thing where you ask the patient if they can feel your touch. If they can't feel your touch, they will freak out. But if they don't know if their feet moved or not, they don't know. Just by you telling them that they're doing good, without saying that they're okay, you're not lying to them. We loaded the guy in the ambulance and he went off heading to the hospital, dying en route. He had completely bled out inside his body. There wasn't a speck of blood on the ground. I was talking to our medical director, and he asked just out of curiosity why the patient hadn't been intubated, and, well, I said because he was talking. Well, that was a good enough reason. How the guy was able to move his feet and his hands with no blood flow outside the trunk was just a mystery. He actually looked really good for somebody who was just minutes away from dying. I got this next bunch of stories from ghostsandghouls.com, Haunted Ambulance. I only have so many stories of my own that I can tell, and I don't think you want to hear just about what I've done, so I'll give you a couple of stories that I read or heard from other medics. The next story is from a guy who worked part-time as an EMT for the county. He was also a volunteer with the local fire department. He'd been doing this for about 2 years when he had his encounter. Being a rural department, they relied almost exclusively on second-hand equipment. A fire truck that is about 10 years old is more than likely completely worn out. It's not the mileage, it's the way the truck and the engines are used. They did have one new vehicle. It was a Ford ambulance conversion. This particular vehicle was one of the vehicles the county bought brand new for their EMS department way back in 1985. They used it for 19 years before it was shuffled off to the fire department to act as a rescue equipment vehicle. And it earned a reputation as a slow, difficult to drive, and possibly impossible to kill vehicle. Plans change all the time, and you have to adjust to every situation as it comes up. Shortly after they received the ambulance, they also purchased a light rescue truck to carry equipment and personnel to vehicle collisions. When traffic comes to a standstill due to a wreck, sometimes you need a small vehicle to get to the scene. The ambulance got another refit because the firefighters' recovery vehicle to keep the firefighters in good shape on the fire ground. You can expend as much energy in 10 minutes at a bad fire as you would normally use working 8 hours of hard labor. Heat injuries are especially prevalent, and heart attacks caused by overexertion are common. Many volunteer fire departments don't have personnel at the station. The firefighters will respond from home. In December of 2012, at around 1 in the morning, the guy telling the story arrived at the station after the first alarm had left. He and another firefighter took the ambulance recovery vehicle to the scene of a house fire. He said he didn't like driving, and, well, neither did I. If you drove the engine, you had to work the pumps. This meant you were outside watching a bunch of gauges while everybody else was inside putting the wet stuff on the red stuff. Seemed every time I missed a fire because I had to drive the truck, that was when all the neat and interesting things happened. Anytime I was inside fighting the fire, well, it was just firefighting. One example of this, we received an alarm of a house fire on, I believe it was Meyer Street. Now, in the town I lived in, we had a Meyer Street, a Meyer Road, and a Meyer Avenue. They just couldn't come up with a new name. As I pulled the truck out of the station and onto 2nd Street, I could see flames above the treetops. This is not good. I immediately I had the passenger in the truck, call dispatch and tell them we're going to need some more trucks and some more firefighters. We rolled onto the scene, and the flames were coming up out of the roof of this house about 35 feet in the air, and they were blue. A normal house fire is red and yellow. That's a moderately warm fire. This was a gas fire, and it was blue. When I stopped the truck, my back was to the fire as I worked the pump panel, and I had to put my bunker coat on. That's that big yellow coat firefighters wear. I had to flip the collar up, and I had to use my gloves because the gauges and the knobs got too hot to touch. It turned out the guy living in the house had flooded the entire interior with pure oxygen. He did this every day. He had about 10 of those giant oxygen cylinders placed all over his house, and he'd just crack open a valve when he got home. And then there was a spark, and his whole house went up in flames. I have never seen a house that hot. Anyway, back to the guy driving to the house fire and the story. He said the roads were awful as the pair made their way to the fire. There was snow-covered ice, and sleet was coming down heavy enough that they couldn't see more than 50 feet ahead of the vehicle. The guy on the right side of the front seat has a few jobs to do while en route. He has to watch for any hazards on his side of the truck. He's responsible for using a map if the scene is in some unknown location, and his job is to work the radio so the driver could focus on driving. Well, sometimes the drivers get excited and they'll grab for the mic wanting to ask something or say something. As the driver reached for the mic, the passenger grabbed it as well. Their hands kind of collided in front of the hook, and they bumped the box with all the light controls on it, and the interior lights all came on. Driving with the interior lights on can be a bad idea because it makes seeing out the window hard at night. The overhead lights can make seeing hard as well if it's snowing hard or there's a fog. The firefighter on the right side managed to answer the radio while the driver began flipping switches, turning off the lights so he could see again. He glanced in the rearview mirror, looking into the patient compartment. There, sitting on the side bench of the work area, was a young girl wearing a day-glow yellow t-shirt and shorts. As she looked up at the driver, just as his finger hit the switch, sending the rear compartment into total darkness. The driver was confused. How could somebody have gotten in the back of the ambulance? He slammed on the brakes and the unit skidded a bit, and it managed to slow down on the slippery streets. He immediately flipped all the switches back on to illuminate the rear, and the sea hood snuck into the ambulance. The rear compartment was empty. Once the ambulance had stopped, the driver jumped out, thinking that the young girl must have bailed as soon as the lights were on. Even though it was just seconds from the time he saw her and turned the lights off and then on, he ran to the rear doors, thinking she had to be there. There was nobody there, and the snow was undisturbed. He quickly ran to the right side door, but once again the snow showed no sign of anybody having walked or run from the ambulance. The other firefighter really thought his partner was either seeing things or messing with him. The driver asked the passenger to take over the wheel, as he was too shook up to even try driving. As the ambulance continued on to the fire, the firefighter, now on the right-hand seat, kept looking in the back, trying to see the girl again, or at least figure out what could have happened to her, or what in the back of the ambulance could have looked like a young girl. They got to the scene of the fire. The house was a total loss. We would have said that we saved the slab. No one was hurt, so the ambulance was used to warm up and recover from the work putting out the fire. Naturally, as soon as the mop-up began, the second man from the ambulance told everybody how his partner had freaked out, claiming to see somebody that wasn't there. One of the senior paramedics overheard the story going around, and he mentioned that back when the ambulance was still with EMS in the 90s, there had been reports of strange things happening in and around the unit. The back doors would sometimes open all by themselves, parked in the bay, even when the doors were all locked and nobody was close enough to have opened them. The lights would come on, all by their own. The paramedics sometimes would hear whispers coming from the rear when there was nobody back there. After several years of unexplained activity in the unit, the ambulance was finally passed on to another department. The driver from that weird night placed a note in the glove compartment to let the next fire station know to keep their eyes open. With that, I'm going to take a brief pause and play a couple of commercials and drink some coffee, so don't go away. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Stop squinting and start seeing. Makeup isn't something you want to just smear on and hope for the best. You might come out looking like Lon Chaney. Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and get a free makeover to see how makeup should be done. 956-723-3019. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Trike. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. The station I was in was not haunted. About the only weird thing we ever had was the sound of alligators barking late at night. It actually sounds just like dogs barking. Armand Bayou was right out behind our back doors, and the park is full of these giant reptiles. As station number 1 was haunted. In the bunk room was a small window, right about 4 feet up from the floor. It was about 8 inches wide and about 12 high. Late at night, a face would be seen, as if somebody was looking into the room. The face would be right up against the glass. There was no way anyone could have been standing in the spot because the air conditioner was right outside that wall. For a person to stand looking in, they would have to have been on top of the unit, and they wouldn't have been able to get close to the glass. The face was seen by just about everybody that ever spent a few months at the station. Finally, somebody cut a piece of plywood and they stuck it over the opening so they could get some sleep at night. It was believed that the spirit may have been one of the firefighters that had died from a heart attack years ago. No one knew he was dead until the following shift. We used to take turns filling in the new guys on why the plywood was over the window. I didn't want them to miss out on anything. Here's another story I found from ghostsandghouls.com. In some jurisdictions, the EMS were authorized to declare a victim as being deceased. We could determine if a person was obviously dead since we worked way out in the middle of nowhere. The EMT in this next story said he'd had a few weird calls over the years. He told of one call in particular where they were responding to a major accident. We call these 1050s. Other departments use other designations. When they arrived on the scene, they found there were 2 people who would not be making it to the hospital. We call this a DRT, for dead right there. The vehicle had been in a head-on with another vehicle, killing 2 of the 3 people instantly. The child that had been sitting in between her folks survived due to their bodies cushioning her from the impact. The child was sent on ahead for treatment while the second ambulance loaded the bodies for transport to the medical examiner's office. Rural departments do this a lot since there is seldom a vehicle for transporting the dead. Most ambulances can transport 3 patients on stretchers and backboards. That's why the bench seat is designed the way it is. There are some braces that can support a second backboard suspended from the ceiling. The husband was placed on the bench seat, strapped to a backboard. The wife was strapped onto the stretcher, sitting on the floor. Since there was no medical treatment needed, the medics both jumped up front for a ride into town. As they were driving along, the passenger looked back into the work area and he noticed that the husband's arm had slipped out from under the strap and it had landed on the floor. Well, he went back to restrap the man's hand, but as he was about to lift the extremity from the floor, the wife's arm popped off the side of the stretcher, landing with the hand in her husband's hand. This freaked out the medic, and he all but ran back to his seat. The senior medic saw what had happened. As the ambulance rolled through the night, it looked as if the 2 in the back were holding their hands on the way to town. The same medic had a patient on another occasion, a young woman who was in full liver failure. Her skin had that orange tinge to it. And she was still conscious at the time. Liver failure causes your eyes to turn yellow, which is then followed by your skin turning yellow, and then it gets kind of an orange color, and that's when you know it's pretty much over. The patient asked the medic what he thought it would be like to die. He told her he didn't know, but he hoped it wouldn't be too painful. Remember, you never lie to the patients. She then asked him if he thought she would go to heaven. He told her that he believed she would. You have to be careful what you say to patients, not wanting to get their hopes up, but sometimes you do have to ease them into dire situations. Next, she asked him if she thought, or correction, try that again. She asked the medic if he thought she would go to heaven. He told her he wasn't able to answer that question. She then told him, "I am going to heaven, and I know it." He asked her how she knew that, and she told him something that he would never forget. She told him, "I know I am, because that man over there told me so." Oh, he immediately asked her, "What man?" As she said, "The man sitting on the end of the bench." Naturally, he kind of glanced over in the corner of the bench and saw there was no one there. He asked her what the man on the bench looked like, and she said, "He looks just like the Jesus on the windows of my church." The medic was stunned, not knowing what to say about this. She then went on to say, "And he says that you're going to go to heaven too. Just hopefully not right away." The medic and his partner prayed as the ambulance transported her to the hospital, and she died about a week later. When it's you and your patient, you get very attached to them. I would tell my students, when you're treating someone, even if they're the nastiest person on earth, you are there for them, and you do what you have to do to help them. A lot of our patients were here illegally. Most of them were just people who came looking for work. On more than one occasion, I had to treat patients that had just tried to injure or kill one of our agents. Yes, I'd put the handcuffs on them, but then I tried my best to act as if nothing bad had happened between them and my fellow agents. Patients were treated like patients, not prisoners. This was not as easy as it sounds, but you had to do it that way. This next medic is also from ghostsandghouls.com. He talked about his visit to the emergency room. This was back when you really had just one big room with little alcoves with curtains for privacy. The two people that he worked with were busy filling out patient reports after admitting a patient that had been brought in. They were gathered around the nurse's station when they both heard a scream, followed by incoherent words coming from one of the open bays. There were 3 patients in the room, each one on a stretcher. They denied screaming or even hearing anything. The medic said he heard from others that they had heard strange voices coming from parts of the ER that were empty at the time. These voices were very much apparent right after a bad case was brought in or they had lost a patient. One of the nurses said she had just worked a code and was about to return to the desk when she felt somebody grab her shoulder. And she was alone at the time. The medics also said that one night he responded to a sick call at about 4 a.m. A dispatch had said that this was a hospice patient with a history of cancer who had not eaten for a couple of days, and he'd somehow managed to pull his medical port out. That's the thing stuck in your arm that you put medications in through. The medics arrived to find this poor guy in his early 40s who was completely bald from the chemotherapy, is sitting on his brother's couch. His skin was blotchy, pale, and kind of purple, and he was hyperventilating and diaphoretic. Oh, this means he's breathing really fast and hard, and he's sweating a lot. The man's sister-in-law said he'd been pacing from the bed to the couch all night, clearly in a state of agitation. The medics went and got their stretcher, and when they walked back in, the patient was, going to the bathroom. He just kept saying, "Oh, no," and he would look around the room, flinching every now and then like he was waving away flies. They got him to sit on the stretcher. Then he kept saying, "No, not now." They tried to assure him that they were going to take good care of him and get him to the hospital. And then he got the look on his face. The lead medic told his partner the guy was about to code. They already knew the man was a DNR, a do not resuscitate. Just about every medic I know has this standing order. If they should have a full arrest, they do not want CPR. A lot of nurses have this as well. The partner walked over to the patient's brother and sister-in-law and asked them to get the DNR papers. It's a part of the job. If a patient codes while you're there, you have to do CPR unless you have a copy of the DNR papers right there. His family returned just in time to see the patient cry a couple of big tears, sob a little, and then crumple. The medic now had to tell his brother that he had passed. This is hard to do even when you know what's about to happen. The brother was overcome by grief and he fell to his knees. The medics loaded the deceased patient into their ambulance and began the slow drive to the hospital morgue. The junior medic was driving and he just asked out of the blue, "Do you think this guy will go to heaven?" Then he got a weird feeling as if something bad were lurking in the unit behind him. Glancing down at the instrument panel, the driver noticed that the voltmeter was reading 666. And then it would drop to 1. It would then jump back up to 666 and back down to 1 again. This happened a few more times, and then the gauge went back to where it belonged at 1200 volts. The driver began to pray as he drove to the hospital, and slowly that feeling began to go away. They never did find out what was going on or why the ambulance would display such an odd gauge reading, and they never got a complete history of what the brother had been doing. Perhaps he was into some kind of dark deeds. In Richmond, Virginia, just off of Broad Street, near the Willow Lawn Shopping Center, is the home base for an ambulance company. It's a small brick building that was once a warehouse. During a fire many years ago, several people had been trapped inside, and they died. They were a group of Hispanic migrant workers who slept in the warehouse at night to save money that they would then send back home. I've known quite a few folks who lived out of their workplaces to save money. It's not as uncommon as you might think. Some of the EMTs work a regular 8 or 10-hour shift, while others work 24 on and 48 off. It sounds like a neat deal until you do a 24-hour shift where you never get a break. Then, while you're home trying to sleep, the phone rings as telemarketers try to sell you things you don't want. Everyone who works a 9 to 5, they don't stop to think that the EMTs are trying to sleep while they're up banging around in the apartment next door. The new medics would be told that the larger room was haunted, and if people tried to sleep there, they'd feel cold hands on them in the night. Not everybody believes in ghosts until they see one or they have an encounter. Anyone trying to sleep in the bigger room would have some really weird dreams. They would also wake to the sensation of cold hands running up and down their bodies. As I said earlier, our station wasn't haunted, but I did have a weird experience one night. I was sound asleep in the bunk when I felt myself being pushed sideways. I fell to the floor and quickly looked back at the bunk. Our Dalmatian, who was named Tap Out, had gotten into the bunk room, crawled into bed with me, got between me and the wall, and pushed. No ghost, just a dog. Back to the ambulance company in Richmond. They think there are at least 2 ghosts in the building. The first one is aggressive being that bangs the chain on the bay door. That's the chain you pull on to make the door go up. It walks around the bay area at night, slamming doors, and he's the one that puts his cold hands on people. The other is a woman who also has been seen in the office area. She was sighted recently when 2 ambulance workers walked by the office window and they saw a short, dark-haired woman in the office. Not recognizing her, they went back to find out who she was, but there was nobody there. On Coast to Coast AM, an EMT shared about how he was off duty and he happened to drive up on a bad car accident. He pulled over to help and he saw bodies had been thrown from their vehicle. Anytime you have people thrown from a vehicle, it's going to be a bad scene. The medic went up to one of the bodies to assess the condition when he noticed there was someone walking around the accident scene. Well, the medic asked the person to help out. I used to say we should charge admission to the folks that crowd around at accident scenes. I especially hated the ones that gave us their advice. I wanted to yell at them. Okay, how many hours of EMS training do you have? But I was usually able to keep my mouth shut. Usually. One time I had a bunch of folks standing together watching us as we tried to save the relative's life. The crowd grew as the morbidly curious arrived. I just kind of suggested it would be nice if the relatives were to get the tourists to stay back. Well, they did. Using their fists and kicking with their feet, the relatives drove the spectators back a good 50 feet radius. Well, back to the scene of the accident. The medic that was working the scene suddenly noticed that his spectator was wearing the exact same clothes as the patient that he was examining. He looked at his patient, then at the spectator. They were the same person. As he watched, the spectator slowly vanished. I found this next batch of stories on a site called Ranker under the Graveyard Shift. One night the medics were responding to an unresponsive female at around 3 in the morning. They arrived on scene and realized the patient was beyond saving. She'd been down too long. The heart monitor was showing a flat line. I always hate it when I see those TV shows that some fake doctor looks at the heart monitor, sees a flat line, and says, "I'm going to shock them." This will do absolutely nothing. You can pump drugs and you can do CPR, but shocking will not get the heart going again. I'm not going to go into all the details on how a defibrillator works, but take my word for it, they don't work the way they show on TV. Well, the crew of the ambulance began CPR and they prepared to transport. Knowing she was not savable and had been down way too long, why would they start CPR? Well, the patient's 11-year-old daughter was watching. It turned out the kid had spent the last 3 days at home with her dead mother. She finally got lonely and she called 911. Sometimes you help the family by pretending to treat the patient. It makes them feel as if they did their best by calling, even if it was 3 days too late. A medic had a call right as he was coming on for his shift. The call was for an elderly man with a high fever. They didn't have much more information because the caller was the patient's elderly wife, and she was hard to get information out of. The ambulance rolled out the door and made it to the scene in a few minutes. As they walked into the house, the wife was sitting at the kitchen table just inside the door. The lead medic asked her what was going on and how could they help. She answered that her husband had been complaining that he was too hot all morning. The medics walked into the next room, which was dark because all the curtains were closed and covering all the windows. There was just enough light to see a dead man sitting in a chair. He looked as if he'd been gone for days. His skin was black, and it looked like something like a rat or something had been gnawing on his face. The man didn't look as if he could have been complaining of being too hot for several days now. The medics got busy setting up their equipment to document the deceased. You hook up the heart monitor and you run a strip on 2 different leads to show no signs of heart activity. This goes to medical control to be added to the patient's records. As the medic was placing the patches to use the heart monitor, his partner switched on the room lights. As she turned on the light next to the dead man, he groaned and grabbed her hand. I hate it when that happens. After nearly jumping out of their skin, the 2 medics managed to reassess the patient. It turned out the guy was on oxygen, and he liked to smoke. He had lit up while having a mask on his face. The cigarette and oxygen reacted, causing his face to flare up and melt onto his mouth. Most of his clothes had burned, and this is why he was complaining about being too hot. He'd been on fire. The fire went out quickly, but the patient was still burned. The medics loaded the guy on the stretcher and they ran code 3 to the ER. Back when I rode a fire truck for a living, I was sitting in the office one night when a call came in. I answered to find a woman in hysterics. She was babbling about blood and her baby. She screamed and cried as if the world, or at least her part of it, was coming to an end. You have to get information from these people, and sometimes it is near impossible. I tell people it's a good idea to have a list of home phone number along with the address sitting right next to the phone. It's amazing what people can't tell you in a crisis situation. This was long before 911 and computers that would tell you where the patient was. I managed to calm the woman down enough to get the address, and I got a callback number. I had already started the ambulance en route to the call before I had half the information. Unit 520. Get the engine started and out the door as I was talking to this semi-hysterical mother. I had to hang up the phone so I could get busy with all the other things I had to do, like calling the police. I could just picture some guy in a hockey mask holding a huge butcher knife hiding in the closet. As 520 was flying across town, the medics do that when you say there's an injured kid, the phone rang. This time, the woman was laughing. Now I could picture an insane woman holding a dead baby in one hand and a butcher knife in the other. The medics might walk in on a crazy woman with a knife. She was having a hard time talking, but I finally found out why. It turns out the baby wasn't injured. There was no blood. Her husband had spilled a glass of tomato juice into the crib. He went to get a rag, and the kid began crawling around through the juice. It was on everything, and the mother had panicked. The ambulance still showed up just to be sure, and yes, there was a crib full of tomato juice and a very embarrassed couple. This last story comes from emergencymedicalparamedic.com. The call came in as a 62-year-old male who had apparently collapsed at home and had stopped breathing. Due to the caller's words, the call was considered a potential hoax. This is how the conversation went once the dispatch had gotten the initial information. "Sir, an ambulance is on the way. Is anyone able to do CPR?" "No." "Okay, I'm going to talk you through this. Are you able to follow my instructions?" "No. Please, just hurry." "Sir, I'm going to tell you exactly how to do this. You can do it." "No, I can't." "Sir, I can tell you how to do CPR. You just have to listen to me." "Please hurry. I'm all alone," which was followed by a click as he hung up. When the ambulance arrived at the scene, they found the door was locked. They looked through the window in the door, and they could see a man laying on the floor. The medics pounded on the door and they yelled, but no answer. They contacted dispatch and got the dispatch to call the phone number of the person who had made the call in the first place. The phone inside began to ring. The men watched through the window, could clearly see it on the wall, and they could hear the ringing through the door. Flipping a mental coin, the medics decided to break the glass door. Sometimes you would do something like this in order to save a life, only to wind up getting sued later on by the owners of the house. Believe it or not, people will do that. With the door open, the two medics went in to the patient and they began the initial size-up. He was in what's called ventricular fibrillation, which you can shock, and so they did. They also kept looking around for the guy that had made the phone call. You never know what some crazy people will do while you're working on a patient. I've had people steal things from my equipment bag while working on a patient. I had a guy jump on top of me one time and broke 2 of my ribs. I have no idea why. He just didn't like me at that moment. Maybe he thought I wasn't working hard enough. Well, the defibrillator did its job and the patient went into a normal sinus rhythm. If you're in medicine, you'll know what this is, and if not, just understand this is a good thing. Now, with the patient stabilized, they loaded him in the ambulance and headed for the ER. The police were notified that the front door was unsecured and they were going to swing by as soon as they could. When the police did make it to the scene, they didn't find anyone else in the house or any sign that anyone had been there. At the ER, the patient was treated for his heart attack and then admitted for further treatment. Well, the medics were at the hospital later on with another patient, and they decided to just swing by and see how their guy was doing. Like I said, you get attached to your patients. The patient thanked them for saving his life. One of the medics asked, who was the person that made the phone call? The man said he didn't know because he lived alone. They asked if there had been a visitor or somebody had come by The man insisted he was alone at the time. He'd felt difficulty breathing, and then he'd passed out. Then the patient said he had a strange dream while he was laying on the floor. He said somebody kept telling him he shouldn't go yet because help was on the way. The voice kept saying it wasn't his time yet. The patient said he never did make a call because he didn't think he needed an ambulance until it was already too late. None of his neighbors knew anything was wrong until the next day. So, who made the call? And who was it that kept telling him it wasn't his time yet? Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends to listen up. Heck, tell strangers on the street that they should be listening. You never know, they just might thank you later on. Buy you a cup of coffee. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.